So what makes a great public space? What are the most important elements? And I wonder if you could go around the world, or maybe your favorite public spaces are just in Toronto, I don't know, but pick a few of your favorite public spaces and tell us what makes them work.
So a lot of it depends upon the scale. So what makes a space work depends upon its scale and what it's trying to do. You know, I ask this question every year to our committee members, but also to people at the conference. What is your favorite public space that is surrounded by tall buildings? And it always comes back, Rockefeller Center. The Channel Gardens, the open space, the skating rink in the wintertime, the world's most famous Christmas tree, and the public art. So you have to examine what makes that space so successful and what is its ingredients. Is it the proportions? Is it the landscaping? Is it the animation of retail? Is it the insertion of program, such as the skating rink or the outdoor cafe? Is it the public art? And you would say it's all of the above.
Sure.
And also it's framed in by the tall building in such a way that it actually gets natural light onto its space. And the tallest building is to the north. It's the sort of campanile in that space. So that would essentially answer your question in terms of what are the ingredients of public space. You look at Rockefeller Center, and they are things like providing program that people want to enjoy, seating, public art, having spaces framed by animated uses, restaurants, outdoor cafes, is always a good thing. You know, we've visited now a number of spaces as part of our CTBUH walks, tours, and you can see the ingredients are all very similar. Depending upon the scale, you know, large spaces like where I work, Nathan Phillips Square at Toronto City Hall, is all about gathering. And there is some program and animation there by way of a skating rink in the wintertime, very stereotypical, but also an outdoor stage and event spaces. But the main thing about that space is just a grand south-facing space. It gets lots of natural light. And that's one of the ingredients that makes that space work really well.
Well, you mentioned natural light, and it's interesting because 2016's walking tours by the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat focused on twilight walking tours. And obviously, if you're walking at night through a public space, you don't have any natural light. So what's the elements that make a public space enjoyable and viable, vibrant at night?
Light. No, it's a great question. You know, we were thinking, we had a winter walk and a summer walk or a warm weather spaces walk. And we were deciding what to do this year, and in discussions with the committee members, but also with Anthony suggested, why don't you do a walk at nighttime? And we thought that's a great idea. So we organized the walk so that we would start in 13 different cities around the world at dusk and watch the sun set. So one of the ingredients that we saw, which really helps animate that space, which was my first one-line answer, was interesting lighting. Of course, you need task lighting for safety and septet principles. You want to make sure that you feel comfortable and safe in that space. But it's also about the ambient lighting, the new LED lighting, lighting that focuses on architecture, lighting that lights up landscape, colored lighting. These are sort of the ingredients that we saw, whether it was Brisbane, Australia, Montreal, Toronto, or New York. They all had spaces that had interesting lighting effects. So that's one of the ingredients about making a space successful in the evening. The other is animated edges, outdoor cafes that spill onto them. In some cases, large windows that have restaurants and other uses, office lobbies with concierge, that you can see from these spaces actually helps make them animated and make them feel safe.
On the subject of lighting at night, I'm just thinking in China, there's so much more emphasis on light shows on tall buildings almost. You know, you can sit and just watch some of these tall buildings in Shenzhen and Shanghai. That doesn't really exist so much in the United States, at least. I think it's a lot less common. I wonder what role you think tall buildings play in illuminating public spaces at night.
Well, you know, we certainly think about the role of each tall building in the city, now going back to my hat in Toronto urban design, and think about how it meets the street, but also what is its appearance on the skyline. You know, we aren't, say, Doha, where every building is completely different and architecturally unique. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just not us. So we think that each building has a role in terms of the importance that it plays in the city, its height at major transit nodes. And then certainly there's many buildings that should, we think, acknowledge their height with interesting tops, and those tops being well lit at night. And that, I think, goes hand in hand with creating certain sites that are landmark buildings. But if every building was a landmark building, then you would end up with a skyline that is composed of a number of buildings that are screaming for attention to say, hey, look at me.
I want to shift topics a little bit. The topic of this year's conference at the Council on Tall Buildings is megacities. And it occurs to me that maybe there's a different urban planning typology for megacities. It's one maybe that's being written right now, because this huge agglomeration of several cities kind of bleeding into one another is somewhat of a new thing. Mm-hmm. Although on the other hand, maybe these same principles we've always known make cities great, mm-hmm. good transit, density, public space. Maybe these things apply just as well to megacities. So I wonder what you think an urban planning typology or some guiding principles for urban growth in the 21st century might be.
I think it's very applicable to think about jumping in scales from what you would do in a city to what you would do in a megacity. And one of those things that makes cities successful is to have transit and employment close to retail and residential, so you have multi-centric centers. So our official plan actually talks about 5 centers in the city of Toronto, all linked and connected to transit. And that's very important, and it's important that those centers also retain a strong employment base and have lands, as we call employment lands, for future employment expansion. It's also important when we do have redevelopment in those nodes that we replace the employment that's there. So those lessons, I think, can apply to the larger scale as well. Megacities are cities that are combining together and merging. They each have their own centers. In fact, here in Shenzhen, we see more than one center, mm-hmm. and that's a good thing. We arrive through Shenzhen Bay, and at first glance, as you're coming over the bridge, you think, well, that's downtown Shenzhen, and then you realize, and if you look to your right, then you see there's the skyline of Shenzhen further to your right, and each one of those is actually creating its own identity. And that's really important, creating its own series of public spaces, its own transportation networks, and its own skyline. So each one of those can read as important centers. Some are at scale, of course, that are far greater than most North American downtowns.
Yeah, I wonder, though, how do you make that not feel just overwhelming, right? If you have 7 different centers, doesn't that feel like 7 cities? And especially for someone who, well, I was going to say for someone who's new to the city, but I guess someone mm-hmm. who grew up in the city would probably be just as bewildered with the growth, the speed of growth in a city like Shenzhen.
Yeah, I mean, that growth is happening everywhere. We're seeing it in Toronto as well in terms of just looking at our skyline. So locals are sometimes bewildered by the pace of growth in our city as well. So it is something that you have to be mindful of, but you have to think about each one of those centers as spaces within themselves. And what are their main focal points? What are their main mixes of uses that make them animated 24/7 throughout the day? What are their local amenities in each of those centers? And then when you think about that, then that forms basically the ingredients of good urban lifestyle.